interactive data science project is titled How Serious is Terrorism? Understanding Terrorist Attacks Around the Globe from a Data Perspective. Here we have a basic idea of what constitutes terrorism. According to Fortna, terrorism is, in the broadest sense, the use of intentional violence, generally against civilians, for political reasons. Terrorism can come in many forms and shapes, but one thing that can be certain about terrorism is that this act of violence can only bring about greater harm than good. Therein lies the reason why we chose to do a project on terrorism. We feel that through data, one can gain valuable insights from the trends of terrorism, which can potentially identify solutions to lessen the impact and maybe even deter this dreadful act of violence. Here are two of our goals. Number one, to gain insight to the different forms of terrorism. And number two, understand how prevalent terrorism is and which parts of the world it is prevalent.
Before we talk about the analysis we did on this dataset and the topic we chose, I want to give you guys a brief introduction about the dataset. So the dataset we use is published by Global Terrorism Database, which is an open source database containing systematic data about more than 1,800,000 terrorist attacks from 1970 to, all the way through 2017. This is a database maintained by a lot of researchers in academia, and it is fully publicized and anyone can get access to it. We also evaluate the dataset using the 4 C's introduced in the course. Because this is a huge dataset with a lot of attributes for every single records of terrorist attacks in the past 4 or 5 decades, and there are specific topics we're particularly interested in, so we decided to do data cleaning right before we dive into the actual analysis part. So first, we removed unnecessary columns. Since we are more interested in certain aspects of each terrorist attacks that happened before, like the time, geographic location, who are the culprits behind that, and also the weapons they use, the types of attacks, we retained certain columns like year, country, country tax, latitude, longitude, attack type, weapon type, and so on. This process helped us to maintain a focus on the topic we were choosing, and we essentially went from 104 attributes to only 15 attributes. Then, just as I mentioned before, the dataset, because it's so huge and contains a lot of records in the past 50 years or so, there are some non-values that were essentially missing from the dataset. And these values were problematic for us, especially when we are thinking about our visualization, because it just might mess up both the visualization and also the machine learning section. Because of this, we removed rows that had non-values in the following columns that we chose to retain. This process, we cut about 20,000 rows. Now with all these remaining data after the data cleaning, we came up with some potential research questions from our initial data exploration. And for example, we were wondering how did the types of terrorism change over the years in terms of their location and also the types of attacks. And second, what are some new forms of terrorism that have surfaced recently after we entered the 21st century? The last one would be, is terrorism largely concentrated in certain parts of the world, or is it more widely distributed in different places around the world? Now let's dive into the real analysis part. We were really wondering what's behind the dataset and what the data in the past 50 years or so are telling us about terrorism. So the first question is, how did the types of terrorism change over the years around the world? Now, if you look at the data from 1970 to 2017, you can see that terrorist attacks is pretty much eating up almost every corner of the world. Here we have an interactive data visualization where you can select different year or drag this horizontal bar here on the right to see a display of attacks that happened from 1970 to 2017 around the world in a cumulative number. For example, in the year of 2014, you can see that there are certain numbers of attacks happening around the world. There are about 70,000 of bombing explosion and about 35,000 were armed assault. You can also move your mouse here and hover over the different parts of the world to see the actual data in the country. Like for example, you can see that the darker the color is, which means the number of attacks is higher in the country. In Iraq, there were about 4,000 number of attacks in 2014, and over 20,000 people were killed only in 2014. And the cumulative number of attacks from 1970 to 2014 is about 16,000. As you can see in the chart above, among all kinds of terrorist attacks, there are certain types of attacks that are much more compared to other types, like bombing, explosion, armed assault, and assassination are the three most common ones. And if you toggle the slider and see the trend over the years, you can essentially see that a bombing explosion has been at the top in decades. Possibly, we assume that it's because of the fact that explosion can be low cost and high damage to the citizens. Assassination was once popular in the 1970s and 1980s, but soon armed assault caught on and surpassed assassination in numbers. Also, as you can see in the map, if we change to 2017, you can see that terrorist attacks are more widespread in certain parts of the world. You can see that terrorism is more popular in certain parts of the world. On the map here, you can see Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and India are the four countries with most number of attacks in all these past years. Now, if we put these occurrences of terrorist attacks in a chronological view, you can see the trend here. Well, the number of attacks rose gradually from 1970 to around 1992, and sooner it dropped almost to the record lowest in 1998. However, as we entered the 21st century, the number of attacks rose rapidly after 2004. And as you can see here, from 2011 to 2014, it reached an all-time highest of around 17,000 of attacks that happened solely in 2014. And then it dropped down a little in 2017, but it wasn't as low as the number of records in the 1970s or 1980s. So based on the data here we presented, some people may think that terrorism is curbed and we are living in this peaceful age as we enter the 21st century, but the truth is we are not. And the impact of terrorism is causing is actually much more widespreading than a lot of people may think. Now, as we dug deeper into the accidents that happened in 2014, we found out that this bombing activity is mostly due to groups like Islamic State in Iraq and Boko Haram in Nigeria. And the deadliest attack in 2014 was in the Iraq city of Mosul, when Islamic State killed 670 Shia prisoners. So because we saw this bump in number of attacks around the world after 2000, we were wondering what are some new forms of terrorism that have surfaced recently after 2000, and also especially after the 9/11 attack. So if you look at the news, you can see that there are certain terrorist attacks that receive more media coverage, like aircraft hijacking. 9/11 is arguably the most well-known terrorist attack in recent years that really brought public attention into terrorism. But it doesn't make hijacking an airplane a common theme in terrorist attacks. Now, if you look at the data and compare aircraft terrorist attacks to other categories, you can see that most attacks are targeting at private citizens and probably, like here, military and also police. Aircraft only contribute to a very small portion of all the attacks that happen. So next question is how many people were actually killed in terrorist attacks in recent years? In 2017, an estimated about 27,000 people died and about 25,000 were injured from terrorism globally. And if you break this casualty number into attack type over the years, you can see that there are certain attack type that contribute to more death, like bombing, explosion, armed assault. The hostage taking is incomparable to armed assault and bombing explosion. This bar chart also gives you a sense of different weapon types and the number of deaths they lead to for the record in recent years from 2000 and 2017. As you can see, explosive and firearms are the two most common theme under the number of deaths. As we discussed about terrorism, it's active in certain part of the world. So we are also wondering how do the types of attacks differ by region. We also created this interactive chart where you can click to filter by region and see how types of attack and weapon type usage differ in terms of region and country. And for example, if you select Australasia and Oceania, you can see that the number of attacks is really low in Australia, New Zealand, and other countries within the continent. And the most common weapon type is explosive and firearms. However, if you compare this to other parts, say Middle East and North Africa, the number is quite shocking. Now, as you can see, the most common type of attack is bombing or explosion, and Iraq is the country with most number of attacks. And also, the weapon type differ greatly from, say, Australia. And you can see here, the most common one is explosives. So besides filtering by region, you can also select the countries and see the difference. For example, if we select Colombia, now you can see the number is still high, but not as high as Iraq. And the most common one is bombing, explosion, armed assault, and assassination. And for the weapon type usage, the most common ones are firearms and explosives. Then if we link each single incident of terrorist attacks into the world map and see where they're happening, you can see that just like the chart would display here, the most common three are private citizens and property, military and police. You can see the yellow dot represent private citizens and property, which are basically everywhere where the terrorism happening. We also found out that there are certain types of attacks that happen in certain region. For example, if we will select the filter here and see abortion related, you can see that the number of attacks that is abortion related is numerically small. There are only 33 on record, but most took place in the United States. So as we discuss terrorism in terms of its attack type and regional difference, we also looked at who are the people that are operating behind all these horrible terrorist attacks. So when you look at the data of the top 10 terrorist groups around the world, you may have heard some names like Taliban, but most are quite unfamiliar. And when you link this top 10 terrorist groups to the countries, we found out that most of these groups only operate in one or two countries. For example, if you click Taliban here, you can see that Taliban only operate in Afghanistan, Pakistan, and a very small portion, only one attack they operated was in Turkmenistan. The same applied to the ISIL, where you can see the most number of attacks happening in Iraq, Syria, and Turkey. A shining path in Peru. And this FMLN, some kind of terrorist groups, mainly operate in El Salvador. Now, in the end, we also looked at how did the top target types change over the years. Now, as you can see in this line chart, there are certain target type that receive attention from the terrorist groups. For example, the business was once popular in the 1970s or 80s, but sooner a private citizen property caught up, and it rose up very quickly. It also reached out this all-time highest in 2014. And the trend you can see in military is also very similar. It has a low growth in the 1970s and 80s, and very low in the early 2000s. But just after 2011, it rose up very quickly, just as private citizen and property.
In the machine learning part of our project, we decided to do a prediction on whether a terrorist attack is deadly or not. The reason why we chose to do a topic on classifying terrorism is because we feel that classification can result in greater insights to the rationale of terrorism and can potentially result in greater policies to curb and deter terrorism. We decided to use the XGBoost library to predict if a terrorist attack is deadly or not. To determine if a terrorist attack is deadly, the number of Qs would have to be more than 0. Otherwise, if the number of Qs is equal to 0, it is determined to not be deadly. Here, we can see the basic data preparation that we did for the first portion of our project. We did further data processing in order to feed the data into our XGBoost library. We extracted numerical columns from our library because XGBoost can only handle numerical inputs. Because the original dataset already used numericals to correspond to text labels, such as country and country text, we did not have to process it ourselves to get a numerical number, and we just had to get the numerical portion. The resulting columns that we got are year, country, latitude, longitude, attack type, target type, nationality type, and weapon type. Here we can see the training of our model using the XGBoost classifier. Here you can see the prediction function that we use. And here is where we gain our predictions. The accuracy that we got is 76.87. In order to tune our model, we decided to look at the future importance function that XGBoost provided. And here we can see that longitude actually has the highest importance.